Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Micah.
In the first two chapters of the book of Micah, we meet a guy who's from a small town a long ways away from Jerusalem, a guy who clearly is going to be talking to the normal people of Judah. And one of his chief gripes that apparently God told him to call out amongst his own people was this practice of the government getting in bed with business and then cornering the market on everything, and then engaging in these predatory business practices by which they'd wait for somebody to have a couple of bad harvests in a row and then snatch their ancestral family land out from under them. You're not supposed to do that, according to the Bible, but again, that ship had sailed. This starts happening left and right. And now what you have is such a weird imbalance in an agricultural society where if you don't have land, you're effectively a serf, a servant class. You got a situation where through all entirely technically legal means, the paperwork you'll see is entirely in order. Through entirely those kind of shenanigans, what happened is you created this elite ownership class and everybody else became a subject class. And that wasn't God's design for what his holy people set apart for him and set apart to model the values of his character and his kingdom was supposed to look like. In fact, these land grabs and all these other exploitative practices made it impossible for God's chosen people to live out life in community the way he said they were supposed to, which was supposed to be a beacon to and a blessing to all the nations. So what we get in Micah is because they were unable to pull this off, instead of the nations being drawn to them by the beauty of their system and their relationship with God and coming to the temple to learn from them about God and about truth, instead, they're going to come to the temple all right, but it's not going to be to learn. It's going to be to take your stuff and burn down your corrupt, evil system. And God, through the prophet Micah, seems to be saying, and this is actually for the best. This is what needs to happen. God's justice must be satisfied. And that phrase is scary, right? I mean, you hear that and you're like, well, why not be nice, God? But don't think about yourself. I'm going to try not to think about me here. Like, obviously, I want God to be nice to me, but think about the injustices that boil your blood, the evilest, worst stuff that's happened in history that you see on the news, that you see going on all around you, and you can't come up with a solution because the system has baked in this evil. Think about how much you yearn for justice for that. Well, God is a God of justice, according to what we see throughout the Old Testament. He doesn't like it either. And he's the one who's in a position to occasionally do something about this massive injustice that we don't have the political will or creativity to address. And so throughout the book of Micah, what we get is this 1-2 punch. The left comes in, and it's usually a pretty big dominant left, and this is the oracle of judgment for injustice and evil and oppression, and for everybody being complicit for building a system that is just straight up not reflective of the values of God. Then in comes the right punch, and it's this near-term and long-term promise of redemption. Every time you start to feel like, oh no, like God is super mad and everything will be crushed and destroyed, swept up in his righteous and just judgment, you're like, oh wait, maybe not everything. No, there is hope here. God is going to restore and redeem. This left hook of judgment is then complemented with a right hook of forgiveness. I'm not sure that analogy holds up, but I think you know what I mean. And so chapters 1 and 2 describe a lot of those evil practices that we were talking about just a minute ago. And then chapter 3 specifically calls out the leaders who enable that kind of thing. It specifically calls out the kind of nonsense prophets who Amos was pointing out when in his book, he's like, I'm not a prophet. I'm not even a son of a prophet. What was he saying? Well, in part, he was saying, you got this whole prophet class where they just get paid to say whatever you want. It's kind of like the cable news class where each party can just weaponize their team to go out and make truth. Just make truth. Say some oracles. There's a study, there's a peer-reviewed something. Just say this and make it true. And the people who already like what we think, then they'll have a thing they can say, and thus saith the study, and it'll feel like truth. It's the same deal. It was just that people didn't go to studies back then to gather truth that they could trot out and beat other people over the head with. They went instead to, we're pretty sure God says this. Well, all of these prophets we're looking at who are prophesying in the mid-700s, maybe with the exception of Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, they're all pushing back on these fraud prophets and this fraud prophet culture. And there's a reason we know basically none of the names of those people who just got paid to say things were from God that weren't from God. And there's a reason we do know the names of these people who gave up so much socially and financially to say things that were true to people who didn't want to hear it but needed to hear it. But then after 3 chapters, we've absorbed the left hook of judgment, and now we get the, let's go with, instead of right hook, let's go with the friendly right hand of forgiveness, as Micah uses language that is reminiscent of what we just caught in Obadiah. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He'll teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. Well, you can't very well have that if all of those paths are weird and crooked and twisted up and perverted from what God had declared they should be. And so what we see as we get into chapter 4 is that this judgment wasn't just to satisfy God's righteous, completely fair anger over horrible injustices. It's also that there's a whole redemptive plan going on here. Don't forget that part. And chapter 4 goes on to sound a lot like the message of Isaiah about the busted up stuff being straightened out and things being made right, and this gross, unjust system that feels like it's never going away. Well, both Isaiah and Micah both say, no, it's going to go away. It's going to be replaced by something better. In fact, the first 3 verses of Micah 4 are effectively identical to Isaiah chapter 2, including this language right here. The laws will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Zion, from that mountain that Obadiah was talking about. It's so cool how it all hangs together. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. In this regard, Micah is saying this to the common people, while Isaiah is in the courts of kings saying this to the fancy people. The message is the same. There is a great king who is coming. This kingdom, this redemptive plan is still going to happen. It's going to go far beyond the boundaries of little Judah and little Israel, all the way out to all the nations. And humanity, as we understand it, is going to be transformed by this dramatic kingdom work of God. But there's some judgment and some cleaning up that's going to happen before that. Well, then in chapter 5, we get the passage that probably you have heard from Micah, that maybe everybody knows from Micah. It's very predictive of something that's still to happen in the future. And Micah is filled with predictions. He isn't just doing oracles of judgment. He is calling his shot on a ton of things. He predicts the fall of the north. He predicts the fall of the south. He predicts the conquest by Babylon. He predicts the exile in Babylon. He predicts the return from exile. And right here, he predicts in smoking gun language that the promised great king, the descendant of David, the one who's going to reign on the throne forever, is going to be born in Bethlehem, and stuff's going to start to change. Micah 5:2, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And then the last 2 chapters are kind of a microcosm of what's going on in the whole book, and maybe in a way what's going on in all of the minor prophets. It's held out as almost a court case where God gives an indictment against his people. This is the injustice and the evil and the wickedness that's going on there. And then Israel starts to come around, and there's some humility and awareness, and there's a degree of repentance, and there's hope that comes with that. And out of that response to the indictment, we get maybe the other most famous verse from Micah, which boils everything down and demonstrates a contrite heart of repentance and understanding for what they'd gotten wrong that Micah was charging them with. It goes like this: He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. I love that verse. I've often thought when I've felt really overwhelmed by the Bible and theology and church history and Christianity, all this stuff, I just wish I could talk to God for a minute, like a conversation just between people, face to face or whatever. And I know exactly what I'd ask him. Hey, in this life, in this world, cutting through all the noise and all of everything else, if I get everything else wrong, what do I need to get right? And I think this is one of those passages that actually gives me the answer to the question. Well, I should act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with my God. And then the other one, I think, is when Jesus is like, what's the greatest command? Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law is summed up in that. So from just a very personal perspective, I find that to be a very meaningful, very clarifying, very simplifying passage. And apparently, Micah is holding it out as though this concept would serve the same purpose for the people of Israel. And as we get down toward the end, we get this final bit where we hear about what the blessings are going to be for God's chosen people moving forward and how this dovetails with the grand redemptive plan. Micah is a beautiful book written in a way that is made to make sense to normal people and to acknowledge that the problems in this world aren't really far away in some fancy house or on some fancy throne. Yeah, that's problematic too. But the problems in the world are also on us. We have ownership of the things that we have made, but the values of God's character and God's kingdom are contrary to those things. And even though God will do justice as we should want him to do, that is not the end game. Rather, that's the setup for this grand redemption that is right and beautiful and just and lasting. And in that regard, it's a pretty exciting book. When you visualize the book of Micah, just picture the manger in Bethlehem where Jesus was born hundreds of years later. So we're going to visualize the manger when we think about the theme, reflect on justice and forgiveness and restoration for the long haul. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, go back and read for yourself the beginning of chapter 5, anticipating Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. Get 6-8, which I just talked about a second ago, and then get that last section from chapter 7, verses 11 through the end of the chapter in verse 20. And with that, you've unlocked a new achievement, and so have I. We got Micah. All right, Nahum, next time around. I'm Matt. This is a 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.